I remember my days in university, kind of. They were a bit of a blur of panic attacks, sleep deprivation, alcoholism, being a closeted transsexual. You know, the stuff that we all got into in undergrad that is completely relatable. Now, college gave me a lot more than a laundry list of mental health problems that I can now milk for content. It also gave me the ability to jump past the unskilled and menial labor jobs that you're supposed to do when you enter the workforce. You know, it made it so instead of me being an underpaid worker at a restaurant, I was an underpaid foreign policy analyst, and now today a underpaid data scientist for my state, and a maker of videos that nobody watches. Like, comment, and subscribe if you have a favorite video of mine that you didn't watch. All joking aside, I did in theory get exactly what you're supposed to get from an education at a university. I was able to start working directly in the type of work I wanted to do, and I got to skip many rungs on the ladder while doing so. So, in theory, I got what I needed out of my choice to attend university. Now, I had to draft a lot of versions of the script you're listening to right now in order for me to get past this really straightforward observation about the value of an education, which was me always intuitively assigning the value of my education to the money I've earned, the career I have, the rungs on the ladder I got to skip. And it actually took the third draft of this script before I began to develop the seemingly unintuitive thought of discussing the value of my education being in the context of what I really learned. Like, what did I actually learn at university? What are the skills that it gave me beyond being able to skip rungs on an employment ladder? And I don't think I'm alone in this lack of an understanding of how to assess the value of an education. After all, one of the most common critiques in American politics today is to make fun of American education and how bad it is, with one of my personal favorites being John Mulaney pointing out that he paid $120,000 for an English degree.
I'd say that I already gave them $120,000.
The always original and definitely profound observation that you don't learn how to pay your taxes at high school.
I wasn't taught how to pay tax, but I know loads about Shakespeare's classics.
And the now more modern and unhinged railing against education by pointing out that it teaches woke ideology into the lives of the youth, whatever that means.
First graders shouldn't have woke gender ideology imposed in their curriculums.
And all of this mismatch of how I understand the value of an education and the place that all of these critiques of American education are coming from is exactly what led me to want to make this video. I'm fascinated as to why it is that when we talk about education, it's always in the context of a price tag. It's always about whether or not you learned how to read a W-2 form during it, and it's always about whether or not critical race theory is present in education. All of this is astonishingly interesting to me to unpack, and that's where all of this video's ideas come from. This video seeks to answer 4 major questions that have been on my mind. First, how do we actually talk about education theory and the content of education in an informed way? Second, how do Americans today value education in our society? Third, how do we actually know whether you as an individual are getting value out of your education, and how do we make that assessment now? Finally, and probably most importantly and selfishly for me, how how valuable was my education really? Did I actually get out of it what I sought, and would I do it again if given the opportunity? Cheers. We're going to be in for a bit of a doozy here. And don't worry, it's a non-alcoholic beer. I've decided that maybe I should stop using shooting a video as an excuse to day drink. So now I'm getting to LARP day drinking now. Alright, so the starting point for this video is that we probably need to actually have a basic common understanding of how it is that academics and folk in this realm even talk about education theory. Which I know, I'm such a bitch, making you have to learn something before we can mouth off our random opinions about it. I am truly the worst. So the study of how do we actually do education is known as pedagogy. Now, pedagogy, beyond just being a very difficult word to spell hundreds of times in a script, is not just the actual act of teaching, it's also about the process and the systems that come into play on what we choose to actually attempt to teach in a classroom. So pedagogy is not only about what your teacher's been up to, it can also include the concept of what even is a part of your teacher's job to teach. Should they teach you the darkest moments of your nation's history? Should they teach math the correct way, or should they use Common Core? And yes, I do hate Common Core. It is my most boomer opinion, and I do not apologize for it. It's also really important to note that because there's an active process of people always making decisions about what is taught in a classroom through this exercise of pedagogy, for those of you thinking that it's actually possible for us to have no politics in the classroom, that is impossible for us to actually execute on without neutering everything that ever actually gets taught in a class. And I'm talking at even the most basic level, because like how we discuss and introduce the beginning of the civil rights movement in America, whether that's for a second grader or for a high schooler, is going to be informed by the zeitgeist, by the politics of the time. What words are appropriate? What level of information should the student receive? Was the civil rights movement good or bad? Because for anyone who thinks that there is anything that we can teach that is non-political, non-controversial, I want you to look up what Reconstruction was and then get back to me that there's anything we can teach in a history classroom that is politically neutral. And that's why it's so important that we have a functioning understanding of pedagogy, because we do need to actually have clear, coherent understanding of what happens in a classroom and how that decision is made, and we can't really do that in a way that's intellectually honest without us playing in the mud of academia a little bit and saying, fine, fancy pants people with big old degrees, we'll play your silly games. How do you define the way things get brought into a classroom? Now, I'm going to give a definition of pedagogy for this video that may not be super agreeable for all pedagogy theorists, especially those who are practitioners. More on you in a moment. I'm going to say that pedagogy is how we decide what is valuable to teach in an American classroom. And that is the scope more so for this video, and that's to help make sure that we're putting a neat little box around how much we can even be talking about in this video right now. Now, a major reason why I'm putting a definition of pedagogy in place that boxes this video a lot into not really being about how teachers teach is because I'm not Zoe B. I am not a teacher. I have never been a teacher in any professional context. I TA'd some lectures, and I also was able to coach a mock trial team for a while, but I really was doing that in a volunteer, not certified capacity. So while I'm certainly not like completely unexposed to the considerations of how we produce educational materials in the classroom, it's far from my area of expertise, and I'm trying to stay in my lane and keep this video from touching too much on stuff that I think there are more qualified folk who already explore this topic. If you're interested in the actual process of like what a good lesson plan looks like and how you take the material we decide is important and integrate it to the classroom, that's where someone like Zoe B is more your person. And this is where I now need to formalize the distinction between a lot of what is discussed for teachers versus what I'm going to be talking about in this video. I'm going to be talking about something that, like, if you're a person who reads Das Kapital for personal pleasure, you can probably just fast forward right through for through the next 5-10 minutes, because you probably already eat what I'm about to talk about for breakfast. But for all of you who are normal and have lives, you're going to need to kick back a little bit and do some wonderful breaking up of concepts here. Because pedagogy can be understood as a practice, which is how do teachers teach in a classroom. That is what I mean when I say practice of pedagogy. There is also the theory of pedagogy, which is what this video is overwhelmingly about and is what I'm trying to explore, and it's where I'm trying to stay in my lane, is that theory of what makes for good material to attempt to bring into the classroom. I am not interested at all in the practice. Now, that does not mean that practice doesn't touch on my experiences, my background, and the theory itself. And for those of you who want some fancy terms to drop at your next, I don't know, what is it that wealthy people do with lives? A Super Bowl party with a charcuterie board? Something like that. Next time you do something like that, you can drop this fancy word for them. Praxis. Which praxis is the merging of theory and practice. Fuck, I've got the hand swapped. That's where the merging of those two fields is known as praxis. So, for those of you who don't read Das Kapital for pleasure and actually have lives, you now know what socialists mean when we say that we're doing praxis today. Praxis in that context meaning they're going to take all of the theory of breaking down and destroying the systems of capital with the practice of being fucking annoying on Twitter and never actually doing anything about it. Now, for researching this video, there are a lot of different opinions on what ought to be taught in American classrooms. Lots of theories, lots of ideas. Oh god, that was a disgusting burp. Okay, I'm gonna kill myself now. So, for researching for this video, there are a lot of different thoughts and opinions about what ought to be taught in American classrooms, and I am not going to break down every single one as like good, bad, canceled on Twitter. I can't do that. What I can do is acknowledge the work of many other pedagogy theorists who have already distilled for me two basic camps that we can look at for how pedagogy is conceptualized around the world, especially in developed capitalist economies. The first would be the industrialist approach, which is this idea that the point of education is to help develop those hard skills, those unique abilities that just you wouldn't learn on your own, that allow you to do high-level industrial labor. Think of this as everything from being an accountant to high-level managerial theory, being a mechanic, a plumber, you know, like actual employable industrial skills that will create money in the endless system of capital. The second dominant theory is that education is valuable because of a sort of intrinsic need for a functioning liberal democracy to have an educated citizenry. For example, democracy only really works if we're all bought in that the systems and structures are legitimate and real, and it probably would be helpful to have a citizenry that can make that assessment with some amount of, I don't know, informed consent at least. For example, in order to properly understand why it is we put up with a dysfunctional federal government in the United States, you need to know what social contract theory is. And that's where we can hope that people learn that accidentally on their own Montessori style, or we can create dedicated environments where we've agreed it's important that you know the fundamentals of social contract theory so you can look at what social contract you live under in your society and what one do you want. Now, I am going to say that on the face of it, it sounds like one is ultra-altruistic. Keep in mind that this liberal democracy theory can be fully acquiesced by the forces of capital and forces of fascism to completely twist it so that way there is no longer an actual teaching of what social contract theory is in order to create a more educated populace, and instead we are now teaching that there are correct social contract theories to create a more compliant populace. I'm not going to say here right now whether that is or is not the case in any given American education system or level of schooling. I am just going to caution that while it may sound like that one is completely built in the realm of destroying free will and the other is this beautiful altruistic process, keep in mind that it's possible for both to be perverse in their own ways, and that they are not immune from leading to bad outcomes for citizens and the people who attend our schools. Now, I do want to note at this point that I am going to be talking basically exclusively about US education as far as any specific examples, numbers, figures that I pull up and decide to analyze for this video about pedagogy. And I'm going to be honest, that's because that's the context that I live in and it's the one that I'm most familiar with, and it made it so I had to reduce the amount of work required for me to have a competent video by like 20 notches. So yeah, I'm a selfish bitch that way, but you probably already knew that and could tease it out from this, just from my whole vibe at this point. So, if you don't care at all about the US's education system in particular, there is some value for you, and I'm not just saying that to boost the retention, but I just want to note, from this point forward, there is no acknowledgement of other countries existing. Ironic for a foreign policy theorist, I know. But I think we've now done enough stage setting. I think we now have a good idea of all of the major things we need to know to start digging one notch deeper into how education is valued in America. So let us now move on to the second major question that I had, which is, how do Americans and American society value education now, / what is the most dominant pedagogy today? Thank God I am finally out of that fucking trash bag for that opening and all that. I thought it would be like a really good, like, ooh, it's a slightly flashy opening costume choice. I forgot that even in like a 70-degree room, it feels like you are boiling in all of the juices the body makes. It is gross. I feel gross. I am so happy to be out of that outfit now. Okay, let's talk about what we actually value in pedagogy today. I think it's pretty obvious that the thing we value most in American society for pedagogy is the industrialist perspective. Now we'll do a little more of a well-balanced conversation in a minute about how I got there, but like, Let's just take the fact that it's impossible for Forbes to even discuss the idea of introducing not more STEM into classrooms without recontextualizing it as around the economic value you'll produce by having those soft human-centered skills. As machines become more efficient at analyzing trends, crunching numbers, and generating reports, the value of the skills that they still can't replicate will grow. This means that educators should increasingly focus on nurturing these soft, human skills, like critical thinking, big picture strategy, communication, emotional intelligence, leadership, and teamwork. Expect to see greater integration of these into mainstream education as we train to become more effective at high-value tasks involving person-to-person interactions and navigation of complex and chaotic real-world situations. These are tasks that human leaders and professionals will use to distinguish themselves in the AI age. They are worried about these things to make it so you're better at conducting analysis and at being able to communicate your ideas in the workplace. Forbes refuses to even acknowledge that maybe learning how to communicate stuff in a written format is valuable, because sometimes in life we're going to communicate complex ideas and we need to know how to properly write them down in the King's English. In other words, we are so absorbed in the total influence of capital and industrialism that Forbes literally cannot think of human-centered skills as having intrinsic value to humanity. They can only imagine human-centric skills as valuable in the production of capital. And while Forbes is maybe one of the more capitalist-oriented type newspapers I could have gone to, let's just be clear, they are more so a bold example of the way media discusses this. I think we can pretty easily identify this bias towards the industrialist pedagogy when we also look at just all of American public policy for the last few years. I mean, let's just call a spade and recognize that in the current federal administration for the United States, there is a full-throated effort happening now to dismantle the Federal Department of Education. Now, whether or not that will actually happen or be successful, we're going to take and we're going to just push that way over here. We're going to not ponder for a moment the practical way that that might happen, and not look too much at everything that has happened in the past 3 weeks. But it is important to deconstruct why it is this is something that has even become a reoccurring point of concern among, I'm going to say people in general, but particularly conservative thinkers keep finding value in this idea of we should dismantle the Federal Department of Education. Now, I could find two pedagogy-oriented arguments as to why it is that they want this dismantling. The first, they would contend that we just do not have an effective education system and we spend way too much per student for the outcomes we get. The second would be that there is too much wokeness in American education, and removing the Federal Department of Education is the primary barrier that is keeping us from removing that wokeness. Now, I am going to get to the first theme that I noticed coming up, that we don't get a return on our investment argument, because I think it's really important to the conversation of how we value education in America. But I do want to note here that I'm not going to really dig much deeper into that second argument. I think later parts of the video will dabble on it and kind of poke at it, but I want to just clarify here why it is I'm not going to be taking seriously and at face value this argument that the Federal Department of Education has been a major creator of wokeness or critical race theory in American classrooms. And that's because I don't think this is a genuine good faith argument among the people that actually know any of what they're talking about. Now, if you are a regular average Joe person who is super concerned about these things being taught in your class, stay with me. I will get to you, and I promise I actually do understand why you may have some concerns. But if you're like a Ben Shapiro type, who's actively raging about the existence of critical race theory and woke ideology in American classrooms, I really just need to say, right now, you know that you are not actually addressing a real problem in American education. You know that we have not, nor will we probably ever, teach high-level law theory, critical race theory, to anyone who is in middle school, high school, public universities at an undergraduate level. Now, I know that when you're talking about critical race theory, you don't actually mean the theory that you mean to discuss, or the theory that actually exists and uses that term. I know what you're really saying is, you don't like that we talk a lot about how racism happened, slavery happened, and when the Civil War ended, we did not take the appropriate steps during Reconstruction to rectify the long-standing damage that would come from the use of slavery. Meaning that even though it was abolished for the overwhelming majority of American citizens, note how I didn't say all American citizens, we still have many folk that are suffering under the legacy of that racism, the legacy of slavery. And I know that when critical race theorists, or people rage against critical race theory, that's actually what they're talking about. And they're like using this proxy confusion of it's actually about how white people need to hate themselves to rile up, now I'm getting to you average Joes, normal people who just want their schools to not be fucking weird. And I want to be clear. I am with the average Joes, and I think I'm with all people when I say I don't want our classrooms to be weird. But they are not weird right now. There might be some individual teachers who do weird stuff in their classes. I don't know, you can point me to all sorts of things that are weird. That when you have a country of 350 plus million people spanning multiple continents effectively, considering that we have empire all around and Hawaii doesn't even touch the continent most of this country is on, there will just be individual weird things that happen in some classrooms, but there is not, in any major context, a desire in federal education to teach critical race theory either as it's actually defined, nor do we really actually get that deep or that drilled down into what is really being talked about, which is we shouldn't really discuss how Reconstruction didn't really happen. And that's where I know that I said I wasn't going to address it in super detail, but it's that I don't think we really need to pull that many citations or dedicate a whole chapter to this video. It just needed to be something that can be said bluntly. For those of you who are normal folk, I promise you we do not actually teach anything about trans folk in any real detail outside of maybe health class in some school districts. I can say that from firsthand experience. And if you are concerned about all of this critical race theory, the thing that's being railed against is not we're teaching your kids to hate themselves. I promise you. It is that there's a railing against this idea that we even acknowledge that Reconstruction happened, and we don't point out that it failed, and that there are impacts because of that. And I can just attest that we also really don't actually do that, because when I finished high school, having done multiple AP history classes, Reconstruction was like 30 minutes of material in AP US history, because it's considered such a not important thing to understand, to have a complete understanding of American history at a collegiate level. this just is not a thing that actually needs to be addressed in major depth here, and we can just move on to the actually interesting thing that I want to talk about, which is that how do we assess the value of education in the world today? Now, in order for us to talk about this, is America getting a return on its investment in education? We're gonna have to unpack a lot of different stuff here, because you would think the statement, the US is ranked blank in education, is like a straightforward thing that we don't have to spend a bunch of time on. I'm going to tell you that we are now officially entering my wheelhouse as a former foreign policy researcher, because I had to spend a lot of time learning how we assess the quality of education in developing economies. And I'm going to tell you, there are a lot of ways to skin that cat. And we're going to have to buckle up here, because we're going to be going down a few of the ones that I think are actually good for different reasons. So, cheers everyone. We're going to be at this for a minute. Get comfortable. So, the first approach for assessing education requires us to know about what's called the United Nations Human Development Index, or HDI. Now, the HDI is kind of a single number that can tell you how nice is your country to live in. It's not that simple, and there's a lot that goes into it, but that's like the best one-sentence summary I can give you of what HDI is and why it exists at the UN. Now, one of the factors considered for the HDI of a given country is your education index, or your EI. Now, we are already only about 2 minutes into this section, and I have now dropped 5 letters of acronyms on you. It does not get better from here. So, no shame if you need a minute. I get it. We are about to go through an alphabet soup that is probably worse than any New Deal description you can put together of FDR's good old days. This is going to be probably the most boring part of the video for everyone who's not me, because for some reason I love this stuff. Now, the education index of a given country is calculated by finding the expected years of education for a given country and dividing that by 18. 18 because there's just an assumption by the UN that no one in your country will ever complete an education beyond a master's. So, you're actually not a failure because you dropped out of your PhD program twice. And actually, your mom can be super proud of you because I didn't single-handedly lower the education index of the United States. Mom, the UN says I'm cool for not having done my PhD. That's okay. Now, after we do that step, we find the mean years of education for everyone who is 25 and under in your country and divide that by 15. 15 because it's just assumed that you won't do ever even a full complete master's at that point. And also that anyone who is later in life in their education, like you are 30 and coming back for your master's, fuck you. You don't matter, and we aren't going to include you for discussing the education index. Now, the justification would be because there may be more economic factors at play than just how developed is your nation when it comes to a later in life person choosing to attend graduate school. And that's an explanation. I think it's just they had to pick a threshold because they wanted to make it easier to do the bean counting for data collection, if I'm just being completely honest. Okay, now you take those two numbers that we created by doing those two little math equations, add them together, and you average them by dividing by 2, and you get now the exact infallible ranking of your country that is indisputable and you can never say is bad because the UN made it and it uses numbers. It's quantitative. No follow-up questions. And according to this perfect and infallible way of assessing the quality of your nation's education,
Foreshadowing is a literary device, and
the United States is ranked 16th in the world, which is nothing to sneeze at. You know, being 16th at something. The US men's soccer team would be envious to ever get to the round of 16, so we're probably doing pretty good. When we place that measure in its context, this education index in the context of what it's supposed to measure, it's really there to make it so we can kind of understand that we have developed economies that seem to have an average years of education that students are able to get. It's almost always around 10 to 12, and that's overall considered pretty good. And then we have developing economies where they can sometimes be as low as like 4 is like the average years of education that a student is receiving. When the disparity of years of education is that wide, it actually makes a lot of sense when comparing developed and developing economies by just asking what is available for students, and this is how we measure that. The actual quality is pretty unimportant because you can have a masterful K through 3 education, but if your country doesn't have good infrastructure, logistics, and culture to support you going beyond your 3rd grade of education, you will never compete with a student who is able to go all the way to 16 years with shoddy quality. So, it is not a great quality metric, but it's a starting point for how we can compare developing and developed economies, and in that regard, the US is beating all developing economies and is doing pretty well amongst the developed economies, which again, at that point, there's actually not much difference between them, and now it's about quality, which isn't measured in this at all. All right, so the UN is canceled. So how can we measure the education students are receiving in your country in a way that actually lets us kind of guess at the quality of it, not just the total amount of it? Well, that's where I have a genius idea. What if we just make like one master exam that includes a bunch of math, a bunch of reading, and a bunch of science questions. We then pull a bunch of random students from every single country on Earth, like 1,000 or so from every country, and we try to make them a representative sample of students in that country. We give them all the exact same exam, and we see how they all perform. I am sure that this is also a really, really, really good way for us to then rank countries and know the quality of their education. How do we know what math to teach? How do we know what science is contextually appropriate for the given students? How do we know what is a reading sample that would actually be resonant for the given population that we're working with? And how do we know that we are actually taking in the contextual differences that occur in many different cultures around how education is done and how it's valued within countries? And how do we normalize for all of these major things that make countries just very different from each other for every 3rd grader? Well, those are stupid things for you to be worried about, and for this process, we're actually just going to forge ahead and not make any adjustments or do any accounting for those factors, and we're going to just continue to make believe that we've actually created this perfect, infallible way of ranking the education system of every country. Because famously standardized tests have never had problems. Okay, so using this system, the United States is ranked 18th in education, which is worse than it was when we used the UN system. But I'm sure this is also a perfect way for us to know that, and we're objectively 18th place. I'll get a little more in depth on my critiques of this in a minute. But let's assume that we're right, that this standardized test approach worked. How does this change the context of the value of the American education system if it's taken as a given that we're ranked 18th in the world in education? So the United States spends about 6.1% of its GDP, which would be the 36th highest rate of GDP expenditure on education. But that one doesn't really take into account scales and sizes of economies. When we go to the amount of money spent per student, which adjusts a little bit for like the wealth of folk and the wealth of your nation, the United States is ranked 4th in how much it spends per pupil among all countries on Earth. Now, I am going to add a caveat that I had to pull this data from the OECD in particular, which means I'm really only looking at developed economies when we're discussing the GDP or dollars spent per pupil here. I wanted to get every single country, but I'm just going to be blunt here. I did a lot of digging and went through a lot of my normal sources that I go to when I need international data, and there was just not any data set that seemed complete without it just being OECD is right and everyone else is either a guess or blank. So we're just going to have to live with that limited fact that China and India are actually not included in this number. So if we take it as a given that the United States is 4th in the world in spending per pupil and allegedly 18th in the world in educational outcomes, I think we now have enough here to piece together why it is there's a growing movement among the current federal administration to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. So it seems like their argument, if I have it down correctly in my notes, kind of functions like this. 1, the U.S. has a federal Department of Education. 2, the U.S. spends the 4th most per student on education. 3, the U.S. performs 18th, at best 16th in education. 4, this means the U.S. does not get a return on its investment for its education. 5, the U.S. must fundamentally change its approach to education. 6, the U.S.'s Federal Department of Education defines the approach to education. 7, the U.S. Department of Education creates guidelines that promote non-industrial pedagogy, specifically this woke ideology, whatever nonsense. Therefore, the U.S. must abolish the Federal Department of Education. You with me? I'm now going to add annotations here. Okay, now let me just explain where some of those annotations are coming from. So, first, when it comes to the U.S. performs 18th in education, that's probably not correct, / we don't actually know how well we perform relative to other countries. Also, your country's education does not need to be assessed wholly in the context of do you beat other countries in a standardized exam, because that standardized exam may not be actually fair for all countries to be taking and doing. It depends on how it's designed. It depends on who it privileges. It depends on what perspectives they took in when they made it. You can't know all of that unless you're literally the test makers, but I can assure you they have not figured out some magical new way to make a standardized test that actually works for all students of all backgrounds. If there was, we would then use that for everything. There are obviously methodological failings to all standardized tests. We shouldn't take it at face value that the US is 18th, and we really shouldn't care that much about the ranking we have on that test in general. Now, this means, does the US get a return on its investment for its education? I don't know. We don't know. Do we arguably spend a lot of money to have a lot of students not meet what we say are the standards and expectations for performance in math, science, reading? Probably yes. We probably spend too much money for how many of our students don't meet what we say are the standards and expectations. There's still more conversation we need to have about what those standards and expectations for math, reading, science ought to be, but if we're saying you need to know how to read a 5th grade book, and we all have a general agreement on what that is, and the average 5th grader cannot read that book, that's a problem. Or if 40% or if 20% of 5th graders can't read that book in the wealthiest nation on earth, yes, that is a problem. But as for where this whole international ranking fits into, do we get a return on our education? this doesn't prove anything. The mismatch in proficiency standards, assuming they're actually accurate and do set fair guidelines for students' proficiency at certain levels, maybe we have something there, but that's where we have more annotations to get to for how to deal with that. The US must fundamentally change its approach to education. I'm gonna just put that whole thing as like, I agree, but for probably the exact opposite reasons for what industrialists think. I don't think we need to fundamentally change it because it's woke. We need to fundamentally change it because there's not meaningful context to a lot of the material. But that's where they and I end up actually agreeing on point 5, but we then get to the wonderful point 6. The US Department of Education controls how education is done, and it promotes these like woke, inefficient guidelines. I want to be very clear, they do not. And when it comes to the actual guidelines that are in place, I'm going to go so far as to say they're actually probably better than what would exist if we had 50 different states cobbled together patchwork systems. And that is because there's just simply more resources, more money, more expertise, and more prestige the federal government can use when it pulls the people who make those decisions. So we probably do need to maintain a federal Department of Education, and we probably do need to recognize that its standards are probably better than what would be done if it was a patchwork of 50 systems across the country. And that's where we get to the last part of the US must abolish the federal Department of Education. Nar, I don't agree. We should not do that because this is big if true. It's actually a good thing for us to be having standards and guidelines. If you don't like the Federal Department of Education's approach to pedagogy, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You ask, what is wrong with the system that exists? What are my philosophical disagreements with it? How does it fail to translate into proper practice? And how do we build a new praxis of education at the federal level? And I'm going to say that that should absolutely be the approach for the United States, because I feel like it is not in the best interest of this country for us to have disagreement as to what a student in Colorado needs to know compared to a student in Mississippi. There should be some basic agreement as to what are the subjects they need to know, the types of materials they need to read, and also standardization to funding distribution and how we ultimately approach education as a theory and in teaching standards. None of that can be done without federal guidelines, and the Federal Department of Education does all of this. Now, you may be thinking this video's gotten completely off the rails. What does this have to do with pedagogy? Let me tell you, it has everything to do with pedagogy in America, because this is a really straightforward line of reasoning, right? Actually, the Federal Department of Education is good, and if you think that it has problems with its execution on praxis, you can reform the praxis if you're the party in power by convincing people you need to fix the praxis. Say that 10 times fast. But that is not what is done. Instead, the argument being pitched is the total abolition of the Federal Department of Education. So, why is that? And I think this gets me to the answer that I'm satisfied with, which is that it would appear that the education system in America has a bias towards the industrialist pedagogy, towards this idea of industrialist education, in part because of the heavy underlying influence of capitalism in our society. But there is actually still enough of a desire among the public for some sort of mixed approach, at least some amount of recognition of the value of liberal democracy, whatever that BS means, that hoity-toity humanities nonsense, that human-centric material. People care enough about it that you can't just flagrantly abolish its teaching at the federal level where people pay attention. So you find the states where at least people don't pay attention or don't care enough to execute on it, and that's easier to do if there's no federal Department of Education. This leads us to kind of an interesting thing of where we clearly have a pedagogy in the United States in public policy that is messy and doesn't quite adhere to any one specific value, but maybe we can get a little more clarity if we begin to ask, well, where do the actual people sit? Because I think we teased it a little bit, but how can we better understand, like, really what are people thinking is the value of an education when deciding where to go to school, what to study, and how to study it? Charts and rankings of majors at universities based off of how much money you'll make in 5 years are basically par for the course for any magazine or newspaper looking to fill out an empty column here or there. And I think the reason why is pretty obvious. People read them, whether it be students trying to figure out what they want to study or overbearing parents trying to egg their kids on to get a real major. But along with that, there's then the ever-present conversations that I recall overhearing at university, which is the endless circular argument of which is really the most important major for us to be studying. Who amongst us is actually doing the degree that is the most valuable and deserves the most pity and the most patience when they are ultimately stressed and tired? And we all know that this circular argument almost always ends up veering towards STEM kids circle jerking each other about how hard it is to earn a computer science degree, and laughing at the bullshittery of the philosophy students who don't actually matter. Now, at this point, I actually think I need to bring up a little bit of my education. I'm going to get into it in more detail in the next part of this video, but I just want to set my biases just out on the table, show you my cards, so to say. I actually don't have that much of a dog in the fight of what is the hardest major. One, because I'm not a petulant child who peaked in undergrad, and two, because actually my education was very diverse at the undergraduate level. I was doing a minor in computer science, a major in business data science, and a second major in international studies. So I'm gonna have a really good smorgasbord background of the attitudes, difficulties, and materials taught at all of these different levels. Along with that, I really feel like the bias that may have been introduced by my graduate school education doesn't really matter here, because see point one again, I don't really care that much about trying to validate my education in the eyes of STEM lords. I know what I learned, I know its value. And that's where I think I can be actually somewhat of a neutral observer to the question, what is it that prompts so many people to say gender studies, history, and philosophy are useless majors, while at the same time flipping over and going mathematics, engineering, and computer science? Now those are the real degrees, those are the real educations that we need to be proud of. Now I think it comes down to two major arguments that leads to this kind of attitude. The first is, I think, the less controversial one for me to be diving into, and it's not just factually. If we're to look at the marketplace of labor, STEM degrees are valued more, they have lower unemployment rates and underemployment rates, higher earnings after 5 years, they tend to look more prestigious when you then try to find future work, and they can lead into many different companies in many different industries. They can often be very versatile degrees economically and socially. So that one, fine, I'll give to the STEM lords. Now, the second one, and I think this one's a little bit more complicated, maybe a little more controversial of an argument. I think there's a part of this desire to think that STEM degrees are just these infallibly amazing, complicated feats of genius is because they're more visibly difficult than liberal arts education. Now, I'm going to say this as someone who has done both and excelled at both. There is a difference in how visibly difficult they both look. Not the actual difficulty, don't worry, we'll get there. But when I finish computer code in C and make a project, and then I flip my laptop around at a friend who has no idea about computer science, it looks like I'm doing witchery on that thing. It just seems like genius is happening there, rather than what's actually happening, which is plagiarism from Stack Overflow, and large amounts of banging my head against the wall, guessing how functions come together, until I finally just accidentally clear up the last bug, and now it's working. Meanwhile, let's then say you're a international studies student who just finished your 40-page paper. That's hard too. You have to do a significant amount of research. You have to have a very strong command of the English language. You have to put together complicated arguments. You have to be able to stay focused on a major project that's kind of boring, including lots of reading and lots of rewriting, and you have to be very emotionally vulnerable when you seek feedback on it. And there's the additional difficulty of I've never had a computer science project challenge who I am as a person, while international studies coursework regularly made me wonder whether or not I am a good citizen of the world. But when you finish all of that very, very, very hard work, you coalesce all of the back-end stuff, the final product, if you did it well, is in fact easy for anyone to understand. A well-written paper in the liberal arts should be, when I'm done slapping it and I flip the laptop around, people should be able to understand it when they read it. So the visible difficulty looks 10 notches less because all of the same extreme difficulty of work that computer science and the liberal arts both require, one gets to flatten all of that down into a legible paper that actual normal people can read, and the other remains this indecipherable bibble-babble unless you have expertise in the field. So, this definitely promotes some amount of ego amongst STEM folk, because they constantly see non-STEM folk being confused and dazzled by the magic of their work. Little anecdote, I once had a coworker of mine ask me whether or not I was a Mensa kid, you know, that group for insecure folk with high IQs, because I told her that I use software engineering to automate some data stuff at work, and it took a lot for me to not just tell her to leave me alone. Instead, I just told her, no, I just learned computer science in undergrad, and then moved on with my day. But, you know, I could have let that convince me I'm a god queen amongst peasants, that actually I'm an infallible genius, all because I know how to do computer code. And I think this intense visible difficulty and the general lack of approachability to STEM degrees is actually intertwined with that first argument of they just are more employable and get more money. And that's because less people do STEM degrees because they think, it looks like it's just incomprehensible witchery all the way down. And they then don't even try it out. And I want to be clear though, this phenomena of people being afraid to enter the STEM world for a little bit, or this internalized attitude of, oh my God, I just could never do what you're doing, I think also happens with STEM folk too, who think that having a good command of the English language is an optional skill to have once you're a whole adult, and think that having no ability to properly communicate your feelings, concerns, and wants for the world is just like quirky STEMness that they have going on. So it cuts both ways, but one massively reduces your marketability because we want people who make code all day far more than we want people who can write masterful papers all day. Both are of extreme value in many different ways, but one is more valued by capital, and one is a little more difficult to overcome a mental hurdle to enter, and so it creates the cycle of it's a very valuable degree because not that many people do it, because it's visibly very difficult, but it's exactly as difficult as a social science degree, I can just in a different way. And this makes it so less people want to do it, and the cycle begins forever and ever. That seems to be my simplified version of how I understand the current way we got here. I'm sure there's more history of pedagogy, more history of Andrew Carnegie something, a steel mill industrial management class happened somewhere and it began some butterfly effect of things, but my crude observations of the world seem to lead me to feeling pretty comfortable with that conclusion, that it's this sort of self-feedback loop of visible difficulty and high salary, both intertwining. Now, if you are someone who likes to do a bit of critical theory, you might have noticed the problem in all of that assessment at this point. If you're really clever, it's that I assumed that microeconomic outcomes, unemployment, underemployment, wages, are the only way to value education. Notice how that entire framework of how I began the justification of the value of a STEM degree began with, well, they do make more money. It naturally and intrinsically privileged the industrialist approach, the capitalist perspective to education. Now, let us take a moment to acknowledge that if there is value beyond industrial capitalist production, then we have a problem with the extreme valuation of STEM education over the liberal arts. Because if we take just this microeconomic, capitalist approach to assigning value to education, then what we're left with is a set of degrees, STEM degrees, are super useful and super valuable. And then you have everything else is dumb and bad and trash. This leaves us with a society where we then begin to exalt STEM bros as geniuses above failure, above needing to consult with people who think that they know everything and that because they're really good at computer science, they're really good at fixing everything else. Public policy studies, never heard of her. Economic systems, don't understand them, but I don't need to. The value of art and the beauty of human imperfection sounds gay, and not in a fun way. All of this comes together to create a lot of the challenges I think we're seeing in the current destruction of third wave capitalism vis-a-vis the attention economy. The creation of AI that completely reduces the value of art only to the end product being digestible and simple and non-challenging, and the result of the hard work of many actual artists, and saying that is valuable intrinsically because it's pretty, is the exact attitude you would have if you have no respect and no love and no care for human-centric things, no care for what actually good art looks like, no value in the imperfections of people, no respect for all the hidden work that goes in to making every oil painting. All you end up caring about is did we make a product that was profitable and created more value, read wealth within the system, not did we create a better, more informed society? Did we challenge ourselves? Did we uplift the conversation? These are the things that come up when you begin to value an industrialist pedagogy above all else, and you will naturally get to that outcome when you begin to say that all that matters is how much money does your degree give you. We clearly need to evaluate pedagogy in a more robust way. We need to be able to individually assess it at a better, more holistic way, so that way we all individually can better view and appreciate the world as it is and what it could be, not just what an algorithm at Facebook maximizing attention demands, not what does the perfect, no flaws, AI, airbrushed nonsense, Donald Trump garbage look like. We need to worry about humanity again. And that's where we now get to pivot from bigger, broader conversations about society and then individual folk, but in a large scale. And now we're going to drill all the way down to a case study, specifically my approach to education, how I earned my education, and the value I think I got from it. So hopefully we all can better understand what does a robust, complete pedagogy look like for individuals, for many people generally needing to make these decisions, and then at a public policy and societal level, what a better, more robust pedagogy ought to look like. Okay, there we go. I decided for this to do how I actually looked when I went to undergrad, but with tits. That's basically the look we got for this section. Now, when I was deciding where to go to undergrad, I was basically working off of two criteria. One, can I afford where I'm going? Two, how good is its international studies program? And I don't want to get all the way into the history of how I got here, but I was very interested in international studies by the time I finished high school, and I cared very deeply about the subject. However, my understanding at the time was best understood as somewhere between a feckless liberal and a socialist that didn't know anything about theory. You kind of had the vibe of I like Bernie Sanders but couldn't actually explain why other than the system sucks. And that's where I held a lot of very annoying views, actually Israel and Palestine was really complicated. And also, let me tell you, most US foreign engagements abroad were actually very bad and destructive, but I can see the value in ISIS and Libya being two places that we begin to send US soldiers. And really, Obama was in an impossible situation when it came to whether or not to expand the US drone strike program. You know, the most annoying liberal you know.
So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal.
That was me when I left for undergrad. And that's where I began to get the value of my undergraduate education day one. The first people I would ever interact with who were democratic socialists were that I knowingly was interacting with were queer and were holding opinions that could best be understood as introduction to critical theory, or this idea that we don't take systems at face value. All of that was on the floor of my dorm when I moved in. I was already being exposed to the legitimate weaknesses of the American neo-imperialist ideals of massive private global charity and US foreign aid and the Foreign Service and USAID. All of those things being intrinsically valuable, infallibly good, were being challenged for me by meeting, in my international studies program, the first international people I've ever really had a conversation with. who told me their firsthand accounts and stories of US aid helping enable coups around the world, being a part of creating a lot of infrastructure that was just about the movement of resources that the US wanted, and the creation of very abusive trade agreements that ultimately left many of the nations that were supposed to be gaining the fruits of US markets ultimately now trapped into their raw resources with no ability to industrialize. This all was happening very early on in my education, and this was happening attending a university that was, for university standards, pretty conservative, and a pretty elite and expensive private university too. Now, when I came to my university bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I definitely held the ideal that I was going to make the world a better place, and I was going to do it by getting an international studies degree, and then I was going to work towards bettering our knowledge of how to more efficiently make global economic systems. I didn't have many friends in high school, if that wasn't readily apparent. And then something shook up a lot of stuff my sophomore year because the business school caught wind of this real smart kid on a good scholarship, and they decided to offer me a very large additional scholarship that would pay for most of what was left of my tuition each semester. And all I would have to do is become a business major. To which I was very conflicted. And then I kind of mathed out how my credits would work and what I could do, and I decided, actually, I don't have to pick one or the other. I'm going to do both. I'm going to do the data science program at the business school and keep doing my international studies program with honors. And because I hate the concept of sleep, I'm going to finally tack on that comp sci minor I was always wondering about, because it just seemed so interesting knowing how computers worked. And I just really wanted to figure that one out. And this would be, unknowingly for me, the development of a very sophisticated pedagogy for myself. Because ultimately what I accidentally created for myself through this combination of majors and minors was a beautiful merging of this, you need hard skills to be employable and to work in the industrialist system, but also you have an understanding of the real legitimate harms that are created when we decide to just say, well, the highest bidder is the highest bidder for my skills and talents. Meta, Instagram, Amazon, Zooble, Dooble, whatever. They're all the same. Whoever can pay me the most gets my skills. Is there really harm? I ultimately was able to develop the skills to be able to create and deconstruct pretty complex understandings of how a lot of tech and computer stuff worked, while still having the moral backbone and framework needed to keep asking myself each day, am I doing the right thing? Is this work that benefits the people in my life, my community, and doesn't actually keep myself grounded in what I value? And I think this is well exampled by just walking through what is basically a day in the life of Emily back when I was an undergrad. So I wake up, have breakfast with my friends at the dining hall, then head over to my very early in the morning German class to study German. Then I gotta book it on over to the business school to be able to start figuring out how to read a Form 10K. And then I gotta head on over to the International Studies building to learn about civil-military relations theory. After that, we then gotta go to the comp sci building so I can start learning how to properly do memory management in base C. Then after that, we're gonna go to mock trial practice, so that way I can learn how to, read rules of evidence and argue it in real time. And then finally, we gotta go to the library and start doing the bare minimum studying required to be ready for the next day, then go to sleep. That was a general weekday, school night type day for me at university, and it sounds like it was a hodgepodge mess. But let me now say that story again, but in a different way. I wake up in the morning, go to dining hall to sit at a table that is arguably one of the most diverse collections of folk in terms of socioeconomic background, political leanings, race, gender, sexuality, etc., than most Americans interact with on any given day. And that's just how my breakfast starts. Then I gotta go over to my German lecture to, one, yes, just do some rote learning and memorization of German language, but also to be reminded that there is, in fact, big if true, a world beyond the United States and things that are important beyond us, and it is a way to be reminded of that fact. Afterwards, I then got to head on over to the business school so that way I can learn how to properly unpack the way companies spend and invest their money, generate their revenue, how much they spend on their staff, to do assessments on what is an ethical company look like just off of the face of its Form 10K and how it spends its money. After that, we then go to the International Studies building, where I end up mastering how to critically challenge the absolute depth of damage that happens when you don't have good civil infrastructure to help manage your military's intrinsic authority within the system, because the Constitution is pretty good at bonding the people together. Bullets from a rifle can pretty quickly get them to break up and stop defending this piece of paper. How do you manage that? And more importantly, what does it reveal about a good civil society? And what does it reveal about the ways nations fail? After that, we then go to my computer science building to solve some of the most complex math problems and logic puzzles I had ever been exposed to, so I'm better able to actually develop, I'm gonna let you know, linear arguments and logical structure to things, because in order to properly write complex computer code, you gotta be able to create linear logical arguments of what I want to be the output, what are the logical mathematical requirements to get there. It's pretty complicated stuff, actually. Again, just in a different way from the liberal arts. After computer science, I then got to go to the law school, so that way I can go to my mock trial practice, where I learn how to impassionately defend any person or to defend the people of this nation from someone who has done legitimate wrong. Because you got to play both sides and you got to do it convincingly. You're ultimately developing the ability to see both sides of any argument, the ability to unpack complex arguments, and to understand how logic cuts both ways rhetorically. Then I go to the library to learn how to prioritize, having so many different things that I need to learn, understand, and care about, and be able to handle them all in a way that will allow me to sustainably do this day after day after day. I'm going to be kind of trite on this one. I learned time management skills by having to study so many different subjects and so much different material every single day. Now, some of you might be saying at this point, that is such a nerd-ass way to understand your education. I didn't get anything like that out of it. I went to house parties. I didn't take it seriously. First of all, how dare you assume I wasn't cool? Everyone likes the gender-fucky kid that doesn't quite fit in with any particular group of people. I was very popular in undergrad. But also, you did get that out of your education. Maybe not to the exact same degree or in the same ways that I did, but the mere exposure to so many different ways that a high school decides to structure your day gives you actually a very similar experience. Maybe not as high of a level, but even if you never went to a university, I am confident you received a smorgasbord of very messy, complicated subjects for the time you're in, all one after the other, and you're having to constantly piece these with and against each other, and you're finally teasing out the little things that bring you joy and that are poking at the part of your brain that says, there's something here for me. So yeah, maybe you don't need to think of it exactly as rigorously as I did. Lord knows I'm a weirdo. But I can assure you that the robust, messy, non-focused way that a lot of American education works, where we kind of view it as a holistic package, actually does have value, and there is value to it even if you don't receive a specific job in social contract theory analysis. The point of the learning social contract theory is not because you're actually going to literally be referencing John Locke at work in any meaningful way for a job. It's that by knowing about John Locke, this can poke and open up new little ways in which you can see connections of other things. Maybe now economics has a context for you. Maybe now math actually has a purpose for you because you could needle in economic theory. Maybe now there is some value for you learning how to properly write out a paper because you realize that your lab reports in chemistry were actually not clear at all, and you're finally at the point where you can't get away with it. There are so many different ways in which the way education works, when it's diversified and when it values everything, not just microeconomic outcomes, creates a more beautiful and complete picture of education for people. And I would say that I accidentally, unintentionally, created the perfect case study of that. Oh my God, okay, I need to put these books down because, let me tell you, I'm a little weakling. I'm gonna keep the backpack on. It's a cute look. I don't know. I think I look like a tech gal having a good time with my non-alcoholic brew, but those books were heavy. Need you to know that was not light reading. Literally, that is not light reading. So now let us all bust out our blue books, and you're gonna fill out the answer to the following question. What is the value of education in the world? Is it A, the money it generates, B, the skills that it gives you to be employable in the marketplace? Is it C, the random connections that it generates that can reveal broader contexts? Or is it D, it's the social interactions that you have with many folk that may not be like you or your immediate background? Please pause now to answer the question. Thank you. Now, the answer is E, all of the above and more. The value of education can be about microeconomic outcomes. The value of an education can be just the skills you develop from it that you then take directly to a workplace. The value of an education can be the random connections that you get and all the people you talk to, but that's just it. It can be all those things. It is all those things, and it is more than those things. Therefore, we need to have a more complete understanding of how we value the pedagogies we choose for education anywhere. And this is something of existential importance, something of major concern for all of us, because right now, we are very much caught in a false dichotomy that we either get to have a rigorous, competitive with China industrialist society where kids learn good math skills and are able to 3D print when they're 8. Or we have a bunch of needle-nosed, woke ideologue, transgender folk being gay all over the place, and we are now a degenerate society with no values. I'm here to tell you they're not mutually exclusive, and in fact, I would contend the most robust pedagogy of American education is one where we value all of the folk. And we also hold some solidarity here, that the problem with American education is not just STEM people are being annoying and pretentious. It's not just sometimes liberal arts people get way too caught up in their own pretentiousness and then think that they're too good for math, or even more annoying when they just say, I'm not a math person, and then they don't bother to do well in the subject. The value of these subjects, the value of education, is not just going to be resolved by us ending that argument. It's by recognizing that ultimately education is about the creation of a more cohesive and complete citizen. It is, to some degree, the liberal arts perspective, the liberal democracy perspective. But you can't have that without more modern, complete education systems that provide contexts for people. If I'm learning social contract theory but have no actual way to apply it to any workplace, that's a problem. But if I learn social contract theory and learn the skills needed for me to be able to work at a place that is actually of interest to me, I'm now able to assess why it's of interest to me. Where does it fit into my understanding and values of the world? Why do I care about what I'm learning in the STEM context? You need the whole picture, or you end up with whatever this is as your only form of art. And come on, we don't want that, right? And I'm sorry to end this video with, like, I guess a bit of a gray area of, like, actually it's everything everywhere all at once when it comes to pedagogy, and not giving you a definitive go to your school board and demand that the liberal arts be triple funded. However, I'm gonna say you should go to your school board and defend the liberal arts if they're gonna be defunded. And you should go to your school board and defend the engineering lab if it's going to have its budget cut. They are both important to the creation of a whole and complete education. I can assure you, that gray area actually is still actionable. It's about making sure that no single pedagogy dominates the education system, and that we're constantly evaluating the careful balancing act of we do need to create new industrial skills because we do want a citizenry that is able to produce greater scientific, economic, and artistic work, and that requires understanding of modern technologies and industry. But we also can be okay with reading Shakespeare. We can be okay with having a moment where we're just making art and we're not worried about the most efficient technologies for it. We're allowed to have both. And our education system deserves both. And all students deserve access to both. If there is only one definitive absolute takeaway, though, that I need you to take, that I need you to have, it is that saying that the school system didn't teach you how to file your taxes is enough of an argument to demand the abolition of public education. Knock it the fuck off. It is not that hard to file your taxes. It is actually very straightforward and simple. If you make under $84,000, it is like 30 minutes of your time and 7 buttons. If you make more than $84,000, you can just hire a CPA because they might actually be relevant for you at that point. Stop bringing it up, for the love of God. That is the only real takeaway you need to have here. Do not anymore talk about whether or not you learn how to file taxes in high school. It doesn't matter. Is that really where the video